Did you know there have been less than 50 face transplants performed around the world? In today's story, we're going to be talking about one of the most dramatic cases of this surgery ever to take place. In 2006, only 2 days before Christmas, a 21-year-old man named Andy Sandness tried to kill himself. He decided to do it with a gun, and whether it was due to hesitation or simply a mistake, Andy misfired and instantly regretted his decision. He quickly called the first responders, who arrived to what looked like a horror show. Andy was missing multiple parts of his face. His nose was completely gone. Parts of his cheek were missing on both sides. His mouth was barely functioning due to the bullet ripping through most of the facial muscles. But there was still life left in his eyes. As the first responders wheeled him away to the hospital, Andy pleaded with them to save his life and correct this horrible mistake. And save him they did. Andy woke up in the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where he met his physician, Dr. Mardini, a plastic surgeon specializing in facial reconstruction, who promised that he could help Andy, but told him not to expect any miracles. Suffice to say, Andy survived, but the injuries left him horribly disfigured. He had a prosthetic nose that kept falling off, and his mouth was the size of a small, hard piece of candy. Retreating from society, Andy found solace in hunting and kept mostly to himself. When people did see him, he would tell them that his injuries happened in a hunting accident, but that didn't help the regular looks of horror that he received from little kids and pretty much anyone else who met his gaze. He knew it was going to be extremely difficult to live his life this way and started praying for a miracle, something that could bring him back to be a fraction of the man that he used to be. After almost a decade, Andy's prayers were answered when his doctor said that he was going to be considered for a face transplant. It was the happiest day of his life, but that happiness would come at the cost of another family's tragedy. Calen Ross and his wife Lily were expecting their first child together in 2016 when he made a decision to end his life and fatally shot himself at the age of 21 shortly before the birth of his child. Calen was listed as an organ donor and was a perfect match for the struggling Andy. His wife Lily was hesitant to accept the turn of events, afraid to look at the face of the man that she used to love on another man's body. It was terrifying, but it had to be done. The ages, the blood type, the skin color, and even the facial structure of the two men were such a perfect match that it would be almost wrong not to move forward. She gave her consent after being reassured that Mr. Sandness had his own eyes and forehead and would not be identifiable as her husband. Ultimately, she knew that she had to accept the transplant for her late husband Caleb, but more importantly, to give her son Leonard some solace in showing what his dad had done to help somebody in need. That somebody turned out to be Andy Sandness. Given Andy's suicide attempt, Dr. Mardini and the surgical team had a lot to consider before accepting him as a fit candidate for surgery, but ultimately they knew that it had to be done. Dr. Mardini believed that everybody deserved a second chance. It was more so important that the patient has reached a point where they realize that they've made a mistake and they are ready to move forward. They felt Andy was ready to move on from his disfigurement and begin living a normal life again, so they got to work and started practicing. 3 years before Calen's death, Andy's surgeon, Dr. Mardini, and the Mayo Clinic team began practicing for the hospital's first face transplant, which up to this point had only been done a few dozen times in the world. They knew Andy needed the surgery and wanted to be confident in performing it when a donor was finally found. They spent more than 50 Saturdays over 3 years practicing the surgery and transplanting the face of a cadaver head before feeling confident enough to go through with the actual procedure. In the early morning of June 2016, Andy's prayers were answered when he received a call from Dr. Mardini stating that a donor had finally been found. With tears in his eyes, Andy told them he was ready for the operation, ready to have his life changed. The procedure took over 56 hours and was the most difficult operation Dr. Mardini and his team had ever performed. It was one of the biggest surgical teams to ever work on a patient, with 60 different surgeons working alongside Dr. Mardini in the operating room. They started by carefully removing Calen's facial bones, his nose, his lips, and even his teeth, and slowly started grafting them onto Andy. After 56 hours in surgery and 3 more weeks of painful recovery ahead, Andy, surrounded by his family, was finally allowed to look in the mirror. Unable to yet speak, he was handed a pen and paper, and he scribbled a few words that said, "It far exceeded my expectations." After an emotional decade where he had all but given up, Andy's prayers were finally answered. He was a new man. I'd be lying if I told you Andy walked out of that recovery room and started his new life. Unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. His journey was far from over. Andy had to have months of speech and physical therapy to learn how to use his new face, how to speak again, how to chew, even how to smile. But Andy wasn't going to let any of that stop him. Fueled by the amazing work of the medical team and the incredible donor who gave him a second chance, Andy knew that he had to do his part. His mind and body accepted the new changes, and he could finally look in the mirror again. Looking in the mirror, Andy saw the face of a man who had such a monumental impact on his life, yet he didn't know a thing about. So he decided to connect with the donor's family after receiving a letter from them in 2017. He had to know more about Calen Ross, the young man who gave him a second chance at a normal life and possibly offer some peace to his family. He wrote back to them and let them know that Calen was still going to continue to love hunting, fishing, dogs, and all the things that he loved to do when he was alive. He assured them that he wouldn't take this second chance for granted and how thankful he was for the opportunity that Calen was able to give him. More than a year after the procedure, the Mayo Clinic team would arrange a meeting between Andy and Lily Ross, the widow of the man who changed his life. Lily was nervous and even a bit hesitant for the meeting, but when she saw Andy, her eyes filled with tears, and she knew that she had made the right decision. She quickly reached out and embraced Andy, reaching out and touching the face of the stranger, a face that she had known so well, a face that became an amazing gift that changed this stranger's life and helped him find his confidence again. Ross assured her that her husband's sacrifice was not in vain and promised to keep a close bond with her, even establishing a trust fund to help with their son Leonard's education. It was an incredible meeting that finally gave Lily the closure that she desperately needed after the hardest year of her life. Getting a face transplant is a journey that never quite ends. Andy will have to take daily regimen of anti-rejection drugs for the rest of his life. He's still in constant facial therapy to better control the nerves of his new face and will need to get weekly facial massages to restore the feeling of his face. But compared to what he dealt with before, this was nothing. He finally broke out of his shell and is able to live his life with a healthy outlook and excitement on the future to come.